The morning of September 11, 2001, changed everything. As the smoke rose above New York City and the Pentagon, the world watched in disbelief. The unimaginable had happened. America, the strongest nation on earth, had been attacked on its own soil. In just a few hours, nearly 3,000 lives were lost. But beyond the tragedy, something else began to shift the global order. Decades in the making, was about to be tested like never before. Inside the White House, President George W. Bush and his team were scrambling to understand who was behind the attacks and how to respond. Across the Atlantic, world leaders were equally stunned. The United States had been struck, but the shock was shared across every Allied capital. From London to Paris, from Berlin to Ottawa, leaders were calling Washington, offering condolences, solidarity, and help. The question wasn't whether the world would support America, was how far that support would go. For over 50 years, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO had stood as the cornerstone of Western defense. Created in 1949, NATO's founding principle was simple: collective security. An attack against one member would be considered an attack against all. This idea was enshrined in Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. But for all its existence, that clause had never once been used. Not during the Cold War, not during the crises in the Balkans, not even when Soviet tanks rolled into Hungary or Czechoslovakia. Article 5 was a promise, a deterrent to theory. Then came 9/11s. Within hours of the attacks, NATO ambassadors gathered in Brussels. They knew history was unfolding. For decades, the United States had been the backbone of the alliance, its main military power, and its biggest financial supporter. Now, the tables had turned. America was the one under attack, and the world was watching to see how NATO would respond. On September 12, 2001, for the first time in history, NATO invoked Article 5. The statement was brief, but its meaning was enormous. The Allies agreed that the attacks against the United States were, indeed, an attack against all members of the alliance. The decision was unanimous. America had stood by Europe through 2 world wars and the Cold War. Now, Europe stood by America. It was a moment of unity few thought possible. The alliance that had once been created to defend against the Soviet Union was now preparing to face a new kind of enemy, one without borders, armies, or states. Terrorism had replaced communism as the world's greatest threat, and NATO was ready to join the United States in what President Bush soon called the War on Terror. But behind the scenes, this unity wasn't as automatic as it appeared. Many NATO leaders were supportive out of moral and political obligation, but there were serious doubts about what exactly the War on Terror meant. In private meetings, European diplomats asked Washington for clarity. Was this about hunting down al-Qaeda and bringing justice for 9/11s? Or was this about reshaping entire regions? The answers they got were often vague. Still, in those early days, the sense of solidarity was real. Within weeks, NATO aircraft began patrolling American skies under Operation Eagle Assist. It was a remarkable reversal of roles: European jets protecting U.S. airspace. Soon after, NATO ships were deployed to the eastern Mediterranean under Operation Active Endeavor, monitoring for potential terrorist threats. The alliance had mobilized in a way it never had before. As the U.S. prepared to invade Afghanistan to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban regime that harbored them, NATO's role grew more complex. The initial invasion in October 2001 was led by American forces, but soon, the alliance would assume command of the International Security Assistance Force known as ISAF. For the first time, NATO was fighting a war outside its traditional boundaries. What began as a mission to stabilize Kabul turned into a 20-year campaign that stretched across Afghanistan's mountains, deserts, and cities. In the beginning, it looked like a success. The Taliban fell, al-Qaeda's bases were destroyed, and a new government was installed. But beneath the surface, Afghanistan was far from stable. The NATO allies, while united on paper, had different goals, different strategies, and different levels of commitment. Some nations contributed troops and resources. Others offered only symbolic support. The longer the war dragged on, the more cracks began to appear within the alliance. By the mid-2000s, disagreements over the direction of the war on terror were growing louder. When the United States turned its attention to Iraq in 2003, many NATO members refused to participate. France and Germany openly opposed the invasion, arguing that it lacked legitimacy and clear objectives. The unity that had defined the immediate aftermath of 9/11 began to erode. What started as a collective response to terror was now becoming a fragmented debate over intervention, morality, and power. Yet, despite the disagreements, NATO remained deeply entangled in America's global war. In Afghanistan, NATO forces continued to fight, often facing brutal insurgent attacks. Thousands of soldiers from countries like Britain, Canada, Poland, and Denmark lost their lives. The alliance that had once been designed to deter Soviet aggression was now caught in a fight against an ideology and enemy that couldn't be easily defeated. Over time, the cost became staggering. Trillions of dollars were spent. Tens of thousands of lives were lost. And by the time the United States withdrew from Afghanistan in 2021, the Taliban were back in control, exactly where the war had begun 20 years earlier. For many, NATO's role in Afghanistan became a symbol of the limits of Western military power. For others, it showed the alliance's ability to adapt and remain united, even through failure. But to understand why NATO backed America so strongly after 9/11, you have to look beyond politics and strategy. It wasn't just about treaties or diplomacy, it was about emotion. The attacks on the Twin Towers weren't just seen as an assault on America. They were seen as an assault on the entire democratic world. European cities like London, Madrid, and Paris had faced terrorism before, but 9/11 was different. It was global. It was cinematic in its horror. And it struck at the very idea of Western civilization's safety. For many leaders, supporting the U.S. was also a message to their own people, to potential enemies, and to history that democracy would stand united against terror. There was no room for neutrality. George W. Bush's famous words, "Either you're with us or against us," echoed through NATO halls. It wasn't just an American declaration. It became a moral code for the West. But as the years went on, that same line began to haunt the alliance. The world wasn't as black and white as that statement suggested. The longer the war on terror continued, the more complicated the world became. Civilian casualties, secret prisons, drone strikes. An endless conflict began to blur the moral high ground that had once defined the early days of NATO's unity. NATO's decision to support the U.S. after 9/11 was a turning point in modern history. It showed that the alliance could act quickly and decisively when its core member was attacked. But it also exposed the risks of acting without fully understanding the long-term consequences. The war on terror wasn't a conventional war. It had no clear enemy, no clear borders, and no clear end. And that made it the most difficult mission NATO had ever faced. Even after 2 decades, the legacy of that decision continues to shape global politics. NATO remains committed to collective defense, but the definition of defense has evolved. Cyber threats, disinformation, terrorism, and regional instability have replaced traditional wars as the main challenges. The alliance that once faced a single enemy during the Cold War now faces dozens of smaller, unpredictable ones. Today, historians still debate whether NATO's support after 9/11 was a success or a mistake. On one hand, it proved the alliance's relevance in the 21st century. On the other, it dragged NATO into a conflict that drained resources, tested unity, and questioned the very limits of Western power. In the end, the story of why NATO backed America isn't just about politics, it's about loyalty, fear, and the fragile balance between idealism and reality. When the towers fell, the world rallied behind a wounded superpower. But in the years that followed, that solidarity was tested again and again as the costs of war became clearer. The invocation of Article 5 in 2001 remains a historical milestone, the only time in NATO's history that the clause has ever been used. It stands as a reminder of both unity and consequence. NATO proved that it could act when it mattered most, but it also learned that even the strongest alliances can't solve every problem with force. As the echoes of 9/11 fade into history, the lessons of that time remain as relevant as ever. Power without foresight can be dangerous. Unity without understanding can lead to division. And even the greatest alliances, built on trust and shared values, must constantly adapt to survive. The story of NATO's decision to support the U.S. isn't just about what happened after 9/11. It's about how the world changed because of it. It's about the price of solidarity, the complexity of power, and the reality that in the fight against fear, victory is never absolute. This is the legacy of Article 5, the day NATO stood with America, the day the world declared that an attack on one was an attack on all, and the day the war on terror began, a war that still shapes the world we live in today. This is Graveyard of Empires, where power meets history, and history always remembers.